Hello, everyone.
Hey,
Welcome. Um, this is the Edmonton Ruby Meetup, and I hope you all had a wonderful summer. We took a break, as you're probably aware, but it's good to be back. Based on recent things, it does look, however, like we're going to be in this format probably for a little while longer. So Kelsey and I were talking about it, and we're going to be looking at some of the technologies that Dev Edmonton is providing so that we can make it more like a regular meetup where we meet and talk and stuff like that. So keep a watch on for that. Now, of course, the first thing to move on is who your coordinators are. So that's me with the fuzzy face and Kelsey. We're your coordinators for Dev Edmonton. We are on the Slack. Somebody was asking what is our Slack channel, and they found it, so that's good.
and if anyone isn't on it, you can find the invite on our website, which we'll talk about in just a moment here.
Yeah. So there's a link in the slides here, or I mean, go to the website and you can see it right there. Our meetups are hosted. The technology is hosted. When we're in person, we go down to this lovely building, which is downtown Edmonton, Dev Edmonton. So you can see it down there. This is the website, which Kelsey lovingly maintains. Credit where credit is due. YEGRB.com. We list all of our upcoming events there. We have links to all of our videos, I believe. We take video of all of our ones when we were live. We used to do live, record the video, and so you can find a history of everything that we've done. And please go there for any information that you're looking for. And hopefully we'll keep it up to date. So here's the direct link to the Slack channel. We're on the Dev Edmonton Society Slack. We have our own channel there, Meetup Ruby. Now, of course, there's other channels there which are of interest. You'll find that some of our regular members at our meetups and so forth are active on a number of the channels there. Some of the channels of interest is there is an opportunities channel. If you're on the Slack, it's a good thing if you're looking, or even if you're thinking about looking, it's not a bad idea to have that opportunities channel up. You may find something of interest to you. Okay. Now, because we get all this, are provided all these wonderful facilities by Dev Edmonton, we follow Dev Edmonton's code of conduct, which is essentially, be nice to each other, treat everybody with respect. There's an official code of conduct. I think we have a link somewhere, maybe on our website or whatnot. Anyways, we are very conscious of the code of conduct, which means that we are a welcoming community to everyone, and we have respect for everyone. And so there's no toleration for dismissal of anyone for whatever reason. Unless, of course, you're being abusive. Okay, that's out of the way. So today's feature presentation is really cool because of the circumstances and where we've been forced to go with not being in person, which has its downsides because, number one, we don't get to drink beer together, which is really, unhappy. But the upside is that we can do things like what we're doing today with the feature presentation. Dan Moore is in Colorado. So he is going to be presenting to us from Colorado. In a face-to-face meetup, this would be a little bit dry because you'd be projecting on a screen and it would be a little bit more difficult. But in this format, we're really thankful that and Dan actually approached us, so he was looking for opportunities like this, and we're really grateful. If you know other people outside in the community that would be interested to coming to speak to us, we would love to hear about it. We're always looking for presenters. Number one, because then that means we don't have to present. But number two, we want to bring you the widest variety of people. And so that's one of the reasons why we're really excited about having Dan coming in to talk today. So, but we'll get to Dan in just a minute. We've got a couple of traditional housekeeping tasks that we do. So we always do a news segment. And one of the things in the news segment is we look for new things or things that you need to be aware of. Now, I've posted the Rails and the Ruby versions that are current. So I also noticed that the Ruby versions were released like in May or something. So there's no news when I post the Ruby versions. I'm not sure when the Rails version was released. It looks like it was probably a security fix for what it is. What I can say is that it really looks like over the summer that, and with COVID and everything, it looks like stuff has slowed down in terms of the number of things that are coming out. So, you know, it is what it is. One thing I did notice from one of the Slacks that I'm a member of was a company in Oregon, I believe, does a community survey every year. And they actually welcome people to participate. And this is the link to their 2020 survey. And you may want to just go and take a look. There's some interesting things on there to see, you know, where your favorite tools are, where your favoritely hated tools are, stuff like that, right? So it's an interesting little survey to see what's going on with the community and help, you know. And of course, if you go into the link and you follow it, you know, you always have a possibility of participating next year. It's an open survey. I have actually participated in the past, although I didn't this year. So anyways, that's what I could do for the news. So. Okay.
No mention of Ruby 3 coming this year?
Oh, I'm sure it's coming. I don't know when.
Well, there was an announcement, a bit of a chat with Matt, and he did say that the goal is to release Ruby 3 as a Christmas gift this year.
Yeah, so normally the major Ruby version is Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So the 2.7.0 release candidate, I think, was December 19th. Of last year, which is what, you know, you look, it's 2.7.1. So I mean, they've done one release since then. Possibly that's because they're really deep into 3, and 3 is a major architecture change. So it's supposed to be all good things, but yeah, it's a Christmas thing. So you know, our January meetup will have lots of confetti and stuff, and so anyways,
hopefully
on we go. We normally do a round of introductions in the in-person thing, because there's really only 3 of us talking. But I figured, but what the hell? And we'll probably get Dan to go through this as well when he comes up onto the screen. So I mean, we try to come up with an interesting icebreaker question each year, and so, you know, the what's your name, and my question for this round of the meetup, what is your current quarantine other skill? Like, what have you been learning? Is it bread making? Is it blacksmithing? Are you doing Lego stop motion kabuki TikTok films? What are you doing? So for myself, I haven't learned a new other skill, but I have, you know, cleaned up my woodworking workshop. And, you know, this weekend I have to make a student desk for my granddaughter because her classes start on Tuesday, and I got to get that finished. Right. So that she has her own little area for doing schoolwork in the house, because she's doing it from home, at least for the first half of the year. So, Kelsey, do you want to?
Yeah. So as Andy says, and as it says right here, I am Kelsey. Over the summer, so a couple of things have happened. My partner, she just ended a year-long work contract with the government of Alberta, and now she's looking for what to do next. So I'm actually kind of playing a little bit of teaching coding, or at least coaching, and a little bit of career sort of career consulting, I guess. And as someone who used to work in recruitment, I guess I have a little bit of experience with that. But yeah, I've been helping her with that. And also, I've been really getting into cold brew coffee. And this part of a 4-liter batch that I made last week, or sorry, during this last week. And I think it's probably going to be my last because it's starting to chill down a little bit.
I have something for you, Kelsey. I heard about this. I've never tried it. But what you need to do is you need to look up on the internet black blood of the earth.
Okay.
Okay. It is a Rhode Island unique specialty form of cold brew syrup. So people from Rhode Island know exactly what this is, and I heard it and I thought, ooh, I got to try that sometime. So black blood of
like heavily concentrated, I imagine.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. It's apparently the thing. So
okay. So we will come back to this, but we also are keeping an eye on the chat. So if anyone else wants to share a little bit about yourself and share what you've been doing, we will read that out for you as well, and we will get to Dan as well.
I like this comment from the chat: ironing laundry and learning some Ruby.
There you go. There you go.
I'm fortunate. I get my wife to do the ironing, but she then went out and bought a whole bunch of clothes for me that don't require ironing. So it's you know.
You know, that is another advantage to doing these remotely. You can multitask because like once you're in a room, you know, paying 100% attention to whoever's talking, you kind of can't fold laundry.
Well, there's some multitasking that's okay, but other is not. Nobody wants to watch me eat lunch while I'm talking here. I'm pretty sure that. So
right on.
Anyways,
hi Chris. We've got Chris saying designing ukuleles, 3D printing via Python and Blender. That's pretty neat.
That's cool. That's cool. I don't know what a plastic ukulele would sound like. I'm a woodworker, right? So I actually I'm a woodworker and a musician. You can see behind me some of my basses. My goal is at one point I would like to build myself an acoustic bass, not a string bass. I have a string bass, and yeah, I'm not going to build one. I like that. It says, so far sounds pretty crappy. Looks beautiful, though. Yeah. Do it multicolored and stuff like that. Yeah. A ukulele would be something that's I think that there's some plans out for. There's plans out there for guitars and stuff like that. It takes a while.
Oh, there's everything.
Oh, yeah. Everything. Oh, yeah. Right. It takes a while to build up the skills. Building an acoustic guitar is not easy. I did watch a video of a guy that built a solid body out of a shelf. So if the wood ages, right, it becomes more dense and solid. So that the lore, anyways, right, I'll stop this soon, but the lore was that Brian May from Queen, the guitar that he used, his dad built for him out of a 400-year-old piece of wood that they had. You know, there's lots of these things roaming around in England. Wow. So that, which is how he got that unique sound, because the wood was so dense, right? You know,
it's pretty cool.
Anyways,
okay.
Job opportunities. There have been a few things that have been posted. I don't know of anything personally right now. I did direct on another Rails Slack that I'm on, which is like worldwide sort of idea. Somebody had posted something where they were looking for in Edmonton. So I directed them to the Dev Edmonton Slack and said, you need to post there, right? To find somebody local. So we managed to get them on, and they posted the job. This would have been probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And there have been the odd things. So once again, I do recommend the Opportunities channel if you are looking, or if you have something where you're looking for people. That's a good place to at least get some idea about who's out there. I thought I saw something the other day for something in Vancouver on the other Rails channel. There's an overall Ruby on Rails channel, which I don't have the URL for, but anyways. Okay.
But yeah, if anyone in the chat has any opportunities, if your business is hiring right now, or if you know of anything, please do share, because I'm sure that somebody out there is going to be happy to learn about that.
And then with that, we're going to move on to Dan and the presentation. So I'll stop taking up your time and we'll get down to the interesting stuff. I will let Dan do his full introduction, including, Dan, you have to tell us about your other hobby while you're in quarantine here. Okay, just to keep us going. And first of all, from me, before you start, thank you very much for doing this. We really appreciate it's a wonderful thing that I mean, you stepped forward, and we didn't even think of it until you had actually reached out and asked us. And so now we've got great ideas about, we can maybe hit up other people and get this rolling. So thank you for saving me some effort. First of all.
Sure.
So go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about what you've been doing over quarantine.
Sure. So I'm Dan Moore. Thank you all very much for having me. I am a longtime developer. I've been an employee, contractor, CTO, startup founder, engineering manager, and currently I'm a developer advocate or head of developer relations at a company called FusionAuth, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I also am the co-organizer of the Boulder Ruby meetup, and I understand everything Andy said about the frustration of not being able to meet in person, because it was a group of my friends that I got to see it once a month and have beers with and chit chat with, and you can do some of that online, but it's definitely more difficult. But the flip side is you do get opportunities to hear from different people. We actually had Tenderlove speak remotely. So
wow.
Which that was a fascinating, interesting talk. We actually planned to fly him out in May to coincide with the startup week, and it didn't end up working out, obviously. And so he was able to do an online presentation. But highly encourage you to reach out to other people, even people that you think might be not interested in talking to a small meetup group, because it's a lot easier now, and they're all stuck at home too. And if any of you want to speak at the Boulder Ruby meetup, let me know too. So happy to kind of flip the roles. But my quarantine skill, I guess I picked two. The first is I've started watching She-Ra with my daughters, and we don't really do a lot of TV in my house, so that's kind of a skill I've learned to enjoy. And then the second is I took a blog post and I ended up writing a book about it. So I took a bunch of blog posts and turned it into a book, and that was definitely something I don't know if I could have accomplished if I hadn't been kind of locked in my house. So yeah, no
Great.
TikToking or blacksmithing or anything like that, but yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, and so She-Ra is a fantastic show, but about writing and about it's given so many people an opportunity to re-examine what's important in their lives and with their time, and what they can actually do with themselves. And it's kind of uncomfortable sometimes to have to spend that time and be what's really important to me, but it's so beneficial. And I know the whole COVID thing is awful in a lot of ways, but there's been some good that's come from it. So you can certainly appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Okay, so are you all set for your presentation there, Dan?
I am. I'm ready.
Okay, so we are going to step out then and leave you to it.
Great. All right. Thank you all for having me again. So I'm going to talk about JWTs and talk about kind of where JWTs came from, why you'd be interested in using them, and some of the nuts and bolts of it. And then I'll also talk a little bit about using JWTs in Ruby and Rails. So first, real quick, because they pay my bills, I want to talk about FusionAuth. We're a drop-in user data store. We are free as in beer, and our community edition, we have paid editions. We also have a community edition, which will be always free. It supports different OAuth grants, SAML, passwordless, and some other features. And how that's relevant to this presentation is it actually produces a whole lot of JWTs. So about me, you didn't care. You don't come to a meetup to learn about the speaker. You come to learn about you come to learn about the topic at hand, which is JSON Web Tokens. Yeah, Kelsey mentioned in the chat that they're pronounced JOTs. That took me a little while to get used to too, because I used to say JWTs, but that's what we all call them internally. So real quick questions. If I lag, please tell me. I'm doing this, as Andy mentioned, out of the basement of my home in Colorado, USA. So go ahead and let me know. And then I think questions, because this is a little bit of a different format that I'm used to, I think Kelsey or Andy will call them to my attention. Kind of tough for me to watch the comments at the same time. So the other thing that I wanted to mention, this looks like it's kind of cut off. Sorry about that. Oh, maybe it was just me lagging. The reason that you should join the Slack is that I'll be giving away 2 free t-shirts, and that will be given away for the best question or comment, which the ukulele so far I think is in the running. Maybe the ukulele or the ironing are in the runnings right now, but another t-shirt will be given away to a someone picked at random who's interested. So if you're interested, say hello on the Slack, and then we'll sum up the people who are interested, and I'll pick one person randomly and one person for best question or comment. And then obviously I'll need your mailing address for the t-shirt at the end of the presentation. So real quick, let's talk about JOTs. So it stands for JSON Web Token. It's pronounced JOT. And it's a standard. So the IETF took a look and wrote down exhaustively what a JOT looks like. And what they really are is they're stateless, portable representations of identity. And what that really means is that you can deliver someone a JOT, and then they can present it to other APIs or servers and know something about that person. And so that's really great for authorization APIs, because you have one server which generates the JOT and it gives it to a client, and the client can present it all over the place. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that would be useful to have the client be able to present that bit of representation in the next couple of slides. But they're produced by a lot of identity provider servers. And one thing that's worth noting about JOTs, which kind of surprised me, is that they are typically signed. They don't have to be signed, but they are, when you sign a JOT, that means that you can be sure that the recipient of the JOT knows that nothing was changed in over the wire, but it's like a postcard. It might be the best way to put it. So it's basically foreign coded, so they can be sent in headers and parameters and whatnot, but it is very much a public piece of information. So be aware of that. All right. And I am sorry, Kelsey, Andy, I'm seeing things kind of cut off. Are you all seeing things cut off there, or is that okay?
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it too.
Okay.
But it looks like it's okay now. We just have a little bit of your intro slide, it looks like, stuck on this one. Okay.
Guess we'll just forge ahead. Cool. All right. So this is a typical multi-API application setup where you have a web client or a mobile client, and they're talking to different APIs. You have a user API, you have a to-do API, and they're usually backed by their own data stores. And so how you might typically naively implement this would be to, actually we'll talk about it a little bit. Sorry. The user API just has, in the data store has users which map to roles. This is a very typical kind of setup. And the to-do API just has to-dos. And so we need to figure out some way to kind of map between users and to-dos. And the to-dos may have a user ID. And this is what you would do if it was a monolithic application, for sure. You would just have the to-dos table have a reference to the user ID. Now, that doesn't obviously work if you have a distributed system with data stores that are perhaps on different servers. So what how the typical flow might go would be the client, in this case a mobile app, would post the user API, and I'm going to ask in a couple of seconds kind of what we think that question mark would be. And so they post the user API, the user would log in and provide their credentials. And what do you all think is going to get handed back to the client in the in this use case where there's a mobile client that is posting to the login? Great point, Kelsey. I'll send a T-shirt to one T-shirt to the winner, but it'll be in 2 different packages. All right. What we're going to do is actually the user API is going to look up the user based on their login credentials, and then look at the data store, and then they're going to hand back JSON, right? And this could be, if you're living in the 2000s, this could be XML, could be any kind of representation of the user. So it might look a little bit something like this in a modern, microservices environment. We'd have information about the user. Now, that is awesome because then the client has that information about their user ID, and then they can go to the to-do API and say, hey, give me the to-dos for this user. Now, the problem with this is that there is it's very easy for a malicious client to examine this traffic and go ahead and look for to-do of user ID equals 1, right? So they can iterate the to-dos. They can go, oh, I'm really interested in hearing what other people have put in this to-do API, which doesn't matter as much for to-dos as it does for other things that might be a little more secure, right? Or you might be a little more concerned about. But, I want to make sure that my to-do to go ahead and get milk from the grocery store on the way down or on the way home is protected. So I want to make sure that people can't iterate my user IDs, or a malicious client could not. So one solution is to go ahead and hand back a token, right? So the user API can create an opaque token, and it can be any random string of digits or bytes or alphanumeric characters. It doesn't really matter what it is. And it hands it to the client, and then the client stores it, and then the client passes the token to the to-do API. And so the benefit of that is no longer can you just iterate a number and find other people's to-dos. The problem with that is that the to-do API now has to, it doesn't have any idea who this token thing is either, so it has to ask the user API, hey, which user is this? Now, this is a back channel secure connection, right? Because you control both the user API and the to-do API, so it's more secure, but it still has some problems. The issues are that you have to maintain a user to token mapping someplace, and that can be either in the memory, right, or in a database, or a database-like thing like a Redis or something like that. But the user API now has to maintain that state. And the biggest issue is it really couples the user API to everything, because the user API now has to be able to be found by anybody who gets that opaque token and needs to turn that into real user data. So here come JWTs, right, into the rescue. So instead of generating an opaque token, the user API can generate a JWT, and that JWT still may be opaque to the client. It doesn't really matter because the client's presenting it to the to-do API, but the to-do API now can look at that JWT and decode it. And as I mentioned, if it's a signed JWT, be sure that it came from the user API and get information from it. So again, they can be validated by the to-do API without calling the user API. So because of the cryptographic signing properties of a JWT, of a JSON Web Token, you can know that the user API created this without ever actually asking the user API. Now, there are a couple of different ways to sign a JWT. You can do it with a symmetric key, or you can do it with a public-private key pair. And the nice thing about doing it with the public-private key pair is the private key stays on the user API, right, in the user API server, and the public key is published by the user API in a standardized way. And now the to-do API can actually be run by an organization totally separate from the user API, right? Whether that's a different department or a different company entirely, and yet the to-do API can still verify, again, without calling the user API, that the user API signed that JWT. As we saw in the user JSON object, you might want to put more than just kind of a username into a JSON object, because there might be other useful metadata about this user. You can put anything you want that is valid JSON into a JWT. The one thing to be aware of, as I mentioned earlier, is that no secrets, right? Don't put anything that you don't want published on the internet into a JWT, because anyone who captures that can decode it very, very easily. So here is a JSON Web Token in all its glory. So there are three main pieces to be aware of. There is the header, which is in green, the payload or the body, which is in blue, and then the signature, which is in green. So we're going to kind of take a look at these pieces. So the header it's again base64 encoded, and it has a couple pieces of information, in this case, just the algorithm. And that basically tells anybody consuming this JWT which algorithm was used to create it. The body is the interesting stuff. That's what you really want to get after as a consumer of a JWT. And it's probably what you're going to be tweaking the most when you're creating them. So there are a couple of different kinds of claims, thinking back to that RFC, that are defined. And there are claims that are called registered claims. There are claims that are called public claims. And then there are claims that are, I believe it's unregistered. But basically, there are claims that are defined in the spec that are standardized. And ISS is one of them. And that is basically the issuer. But the standardized claims basically are claims that the meaning for them is well known and it's standardized. Registered claims are claims that people, companies, or organizations have put into their registry, as the name would imply, and kind of have carved out for them. And I believe name is one of those. And then roles is a private claim. And basically with private claims, you can do whatever the heck you want with them. And the semantics are totally up to the definer and the consumer to understand what they are. So I'm going to walk down these claims because they're kind of important to note. So I already mentioned the issuer, or ISS, which is the issuer. So that typically is some identifier for the identity server that produced this JWT at authentication or in some other way. EXP is the Unix epoch timestamp that this JWT will expire at. Odd is the audience, and that basically is who this JWT should be consumed by. So you can put in a unique identifier. This is a GWT, but you can call it, you could do whatever you want. Again, make sure it's not public, or sorry, make sure you understand that it is public. And so I would recommend using something like a GWT instead of a numeric ID, because if you see 1, 2, 3, 4 in the audience, inquisitive, maybe not so nice folks might, people who aren't following the code of conduct of this Ruby group might be curious what 1, 2, 3, 5 gets you if you plug that in, or 1, 2, 3, 3. So be very aware of what you put in your JWTs and make them, don't leak any information you don't intend to. Sub is the same thing, is a similar identifier, except for instead of being the audience that should consume this JWT, the sub is who this audience is about. So subject is, a sub is short for subject. And then name and roles, as I mentioned, are less well-defined, less semantically clear. So let's move on to the signature piece. This is the cryptographic signature, which basically ensures that your JWT was not modified in transit. So this can be RSA of varying strengths. You can use HMAC if you want to use a symmetric signature. And then you can also use elliptical cryptography as well. So finally, once the To-Do API has pulled this JWT, or sorry, has received this JWT from the client, they can actually pull up the subject and go ahead and do a select star from to-dos where the user ID is that subject. And so we've solved the problem of getting the to-do API the information it needs to do to get, needs to have to get my to-dos. So there are a couple of things to be aware of, that the JWT specification actually allows there to be a none algorithm, right? So previously the header we saw was I think it was an HMAC 256 in the one I just showed you, but you can actually have it be none, which basically means that no signature is required. So this right here, you can still see there's the green part and the blue part, and there's that period which separates the, after which the signature typically is, but there's no signature. Now, the bad thing about this is that that means that everybody can read this and anybody can generate a JWT that is valid because it's not signed. So that means anybody who consumes this really shouldn't, you should only consume a JWT with algorithm none if you don't care who created it, which I can't really think of a valid use case of that particular situation. This is how it kind of breaks down. Instead of the alg of being HMAC 256, it goes to an alg of none. So again, this is the JWT, and it's important to realize the JWT specification allows this, and I've actually seen people on Hacker News or other websites bagging on JWT as being a complicated protocol that is insecure. And this is one of the reasons why people think this is insecure, because it allows you to not sign your JWTs, which again, I don't know if I can drive this home enough. It means that anybody can create a JWT that your consumer will take as a valid JWT, which is a bad thing, typically. So the problem with that is that, as I already kind of mentioned, that anyone can create this JWT, and the simple fix is you just don't allow none. Now, people might say, well, why was it put in the spec if you should never do it? Well, it's because the IETF thinks about, a ton of different use cases. And, one of the possible use cases is that you have some other way to care about, to verify the identity or to be sure that your JWT is unchanged. Like mutual TLS certificates might be one way. Another way might be if you're generating JWTs on an internal network that is never connected to the outside internet, and you always have control over the servers that are on that on that network. Then you might say, hey, the complexity of signing a JWT or the performance impact is not worth the extra security because we're secured in a different way. So my point would be, if you are at that level of sophistication, one, you probably benchmarked to know that, or I hope that you benchmarked to know that signing is not gonna take too long, and you're generating enough JWTs. And two, you're probably not listening to an introductory JWT talk at a Ruby meetup. So I would just say that the rule of never using alg none is probably a pretty safe rule. And I would, if I ever saw alg none, I would want it to justify itself. So let's talk about RSA verification a little bit. So this is the public-private key strength that I talked about, right? Where some of the value in using JWTs is that you don't just have the To-Do API and the user API decoupled. You can actually have them live in entirely different organizations across the world. So the two API, if the user API signs the JWT with their private key and specifies it in the header, then the two API needs the RSA public key to figure out which, to be able to verify that this JWT was signed by the user API. And so what it does is it's going to download the public keys, and there is a, in this particular case, it's an API that is a FusionAuth specific one, but there's also a well-known endpoint that the specification, I don't remember which RFC it is, but that I think it's the OIDC spec actually. I'm maybe talking out of turn here, but there is a URL, and the user API may provide it as part of the documentation or maybe part of the standard, depending on how they've implemented it, that tells the two API, hey, this is where you can go to get your public keys. Now, you may say, well, gosh, Dan, you promised that there'd be no coupling between the user API and the to-do API. And I would say, there actually is it's a different magnitude, different order of magnitude of coupling, right? The to API may be able to cache the public key for an hour or 24 hours, depending on how often you rotate keys, as opposed to needing to contact the user API every second or every time there was a request, the way it did when we had the opaque token. So there's still a little bit of coupling, but that public key publishing is a lot less of a intermingling and a less frequent intermingling than you had to have before. So this is what that JSON might look like. So it's basically just a JSON with a public key and a bunch of, the normal RSA public key text. You also can have multiple keys, and this can be really good if you want to rotate keys easily, or if you want to generate different keys and hand them out to different, you want to sign a JWT with different keys and have them delivered for different audiences or to different servers. So the way you can do that is in the JWT header, you specify the key ID. And again, I would make sure that your key ID is something that is not, that's what I'm looking for, that is not, doesn't have information that you don't want to leak, right? So it could be another GWT or something like that. This tells me that likely it's going to be there are at least 42 other keys, which may be information that I may not want to have public. But anyway, in the I guess that doesn't really matter as much because this is going to be public anyway, the list of public keys. So you can go ahead and pull those anyway if you were an attacker, as soon as you knew the endpoint. So, and here's so a client can say, okay, I'm asking for this JWT was signed with public key ID 42, so I'm going to go ahead and grab that public key and verify this. All right, so that's everything that I'm going to cover, kind of about like the reason for JWTs. If you have a question, go ahead and type in the chat. A quick overview is that JWTs grew out of the need to basically be able to have a distributed, portable representation of identity, and you can put any JSON you want in them, and you should be aware that they are public, and you should never use alg none unless you know better than, unless you have very, very good reasons, but don't ever default to that. So, but if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to move on in a second. Or 10 seconds.
Yeah, well, while we give people in the chat a little bit of time, I've got a question myself. So you did mention that as long as it's valid JSON, you can include any kind of meta information in that JWT, in that JWT, sorry. Are there any limitations to that? Is there anything like a size limit?
I'm unaware of any size limits. I think that there's a, again, you can kind of give yourself enough rope to hang yourself. You can shoot yourself in the foot, right? If you don't forget, this is going to be something that's passed around on every API call. That is, typically it's passed around. You give it to a client, and that the client is going to pass it in the header. So you don't want it to be too long. I don't know if there are any limits on the length of a header. That might be the only limitation, but it's not inherent to the JWT. We advise people at FusionAuth to keep them small, though.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as far as you're aware, are there any other gotchas aside from using a none algorithm?
Or exposing too much information?
Yeah.
I haven't heard of any other gotchas. I mean, well, one gotcha actually I've read about is that people using JWTs when all they need is an API key, right? If you're not actually putting any useful information, or you don't want to go through the decoding process, or if you control kind of both ends, like if you control the user API and the to-do API, and you didn't care that they were tightly coupled because you're building the MVP and you're just trying to get stuff done, then I would just use like an opaque token or an API key and be done with it, right? Be simpler. So they are bringing in additional power, but they're also bringing in additional complexity.
Okay. We do have a question from chat here from Mark. Have you found the performance cost of signing JWTs every few minutes to be a large burden? And do you tweak the lifetime to reduce that, or how else would you address this?
Great question. So I think that, I don't know what application you were looking for. I always recommend, before you worry about performance costs, to benchmark. I did a performance benchmark of signing JWTs with Ruby on my little MacBook Pro, and I think I was able to sign 50,000 JWTs in like 12 seconds. And so, again, depending on scale, that may be slow, that may be fast, but that's always my first question whenever anyone worries about performance is, have you thought about everything else, right? The database is the canonical, is going to make things harder for performance than a JWT would be. But the thing about tweaking the lifetime of JWT, because they're stateless, and I'm going to talk about this a little further in the presentation, they're hard to revoke. So typically you're going to want JWTs to have shorter lifetimes. And we're actually, the very next slide is talking about refresh tokens, which is a way for you to request new JWTs after a JWT has expired with the client without requiring any user interaction. But I don't think I want to make my JWT too long for performance reasons unless I was willing to accept that trade-off of unauthorized access, because that, when you are presenting a JWT to the to-do API, the pro is that it doesn't have to talk to the user API to verify that this is valid. The con is it doesn't have to talk to the user API to see if this is valid. So if the user API, someone's logged out or someone's account has been locked, the to-do API doesn't actually have any way to know that. And we'll talk about some workarounds you can get to, but that's why I probably wouldn't make a JWT too long. I hope that answers your question, Mark.
And I will back out and let you continue.
Great. And Mark, if that doesn't answer your question, go ahead and type in the chat again, and I'll see if I can understand exactly what the thrust of your question was. All right, so let's talk about refresh tokens. And as I already mentioned, JWTs are supposed to be, oh, good, awesome. JWTs are meant to be short-lived, excuse me. Refresh tokens are long-lived. And so this would be something that, I'm sure all of you, if you use Gmail, you log in once to Gmail on a new computer, and then you, maybe in a month, maybe in 2 months, maybe in a week, you're asked to log in again. So refresh tokens are similar to that. Whatever, and I'm not saying Gmail is using JWTs. I don't know about the internals of that, but the idea is that you present a token for a little while, and then you have a way for the client to request new tokens periodically, and then eventually a refresh token might expire, and then you'll be forced to actually authenticate again. And you can control these in a lot of the identity provider software. You can tweak these to whatever your application really needs. But the general idea is refresh tokens are long-lived and can be used to access new JWTs, but refresh tokens are very easy to revoke because they're just designed in a different way. So this is how you might use a refresh token. So we have a user API, which has the record of a refresh token. That's what that RT is right there. And then we have the to-do API, which consumes the JWTs, right? So The user API also generated a JWT, when the user first logged in. So both the refresh token and the JWT are handed to the client, in this case represented by a mobile device, but it could be any client. And then the client is going to pass the JWT to the to-do API periodically, right? Whenever it wants to retrieve to-dos or update to-dos. And then the to-do API is going to look at that JWT and say, is this valid? And the things it's going to look at are things like, am I the correct audience, right? Was this JWT designed for me? Is the signature valid? Has this, and the big one is, has this JWT expired? And so if the JWT hasn't expired, then the to-do API says, awesome, this is for Dan. I'm going to go ahead and give the client Dan's to-dos. And then it hands it back to the client who displays them or whatnot. Eventually, that JWT will expire, and then the client will present that JWT to the to-do API, and the to-do API will hand back a 404 or some other HTTP status code saying, hey, actually this JWT is not valid, right? Or 403 might be a good one because it's not authorized. And then the client can catch that and say, okay, I'm going to now ask for a new JWT. And I have this refresh token that the user API has handed to me so conveniently. So it presents the refresh token up to the user API, and the user API says, oh, yep, this person, their account's not locked. They've still paid for the to-do service or what have you. And then it says, okay, I'm going to generate a new JWT, which is going to be, again, good for 5 minutes or an hour. And then it hands it back to the client who stores it. And then the client can go ahead and present that JWT again to the to-do API, and so on and so forth. So that's really the flow of refresh tokens. They're supposed to be used when the JWT that you currently have is expired or otherwise invalid. Now, in the case where somebody has logged out or somebody's account has been deleted, when the client presents the refresh token to the user API may say, well, I'm not allowed to create any more JWTs for you, so I'm not going to give you a JWT. In that case, the client knows that it can no longer, access the to-do API, basically. As far as deleting users, this is something that is important, especially if you're thinking about GDPR or CCPA or any of the privacy-focused laws. Does Canada? I'm afraid I don't know if Canada has a GDPR analog.
Yeah, we've got something, I believe it started a couple of years ago, called CAN-SPAM, which is very similar. You do have to give people an option to opt out whenever you have a communication with them. You have to give them an option to remove their information from your servers. Very similar, I believe. I think we followed Europe's lead on that because I think they were kind of leading the charge on innovating with user privacy kind of regulations.
Great. Wise choice, following Europe's lead. Good idea. So you want to be able to present people with what their information is, or be able to delete their information if they say, hey, forget me. I'm done with your to-do app. I found another way to keep track of how I'm going to get my milk today. So, in a monolithic app, like a Rails app, you might do just a delete, right? And you might do a delete based on from the to-do table, or you might use a cascade if you were all in one database. But you don't have that when you're in a distributed system anymore. So you can't just delete the user and know that all of the relationships that user was entwined in are going to be deleted as well. So you have a couple options for dealing with this. And the first is you can push the complexity to the client. And so if you have a web client who's issuing deletes, before when the person says, hey, delete my account, or they're removing the app from their device, you could have the client go ahead and call delete on the user API and also delete on the to-do API. Now, I am a big fan of pushing as much complexity up to the server as possible, just because I think that developers on a server, I take that back, not developers, but things on the server are better able to handle these kind of complicated use cases. So I think it's better to push it to the backend system. One way to do that is with webhooks. So basically, any API that says, I'm going to get user data via JWT or any other way, says to the user API that is kind of your identity store, it says, hey, let me know when certain events happen. And one event could be the user's account's disabled, but another event could be the user wants to be deleted. And in this case, when the user is deleted, the to API gets a webhook that says, user 12345 is now deleted. Go ahead and delete any data that they have. And this doesn't matter very much when you have 2 services, but if you have 20, then that kind of centralized, the client. So the complexity is centralized in the user API as opposed to being on the client, where the client has to call 20 different APIs to delete the user's data. So logout is something that you want to be thinking about. And in general, in the JWT scenario, when you think about logging people out, you're thinking about revoking their refresh token. So the next time some client asks for the refresh token, next time a client presents a refresh token and asks for a new JWT, the JWT is not generated for them because the token has been revoked. So how that might work is that when a user logs out from the mobile client, then the client will let the user API know that, and then that refresh token will be revoked. But the JWT will be deleted from the client could conceivably be out there, right? And so it could still be presented to the to-do API to get the person's to-dos. And we'll talk about how to deal with that in the next slide or two. You want to make sure that you can revoke all the refresh tokens that might be applicable to your application. Because again, this is a simplified example of one API, or 2 APIs really, but you could have, a normal application might talk to 5 or 10 APIs. It's hard to know. So speaking about that JWT still hanging around, right, which we saw on this slide here, it was removed from the client, but it still could have been caught in transit, or there could be another malicious application on this client who was able to read the JWT. How can you deal with revoking those? I already said that they were stateless, and that's the good and the bad of JWTs. So let's talk about things that you can think about doing when you're talking about revoking JWTs. And you also want to think about how common is the use case? What's the severity? If it's just someone logging out, then waiting for the JWTs to expire may be okay. If it's something else where a user's account has been breached, an admin account has been breached, and you want to make sure that any of the JWTs they have outstanding are invalidated, then you could do a couple of different things. But you're going to want to make sure you kind of tune these based on the possible ramifications of the unauthorized access. So the first thing you could do is you could rotate your keys. And so this would basically mean that if you had a symmetric key, you would change a symmetric key. If you had a public-private key, you would change the public-private key, and you'd remove the previous private key, or you'd remove the previous public key from that list of keys, so that any JWTs that had been signed by those keys, either the symmetric key or the private key, would be invalid. And that is super painful, right? Because it could affect lots and lots of other clients. So this would be an option if things were really, really bad, right? If a super user account had been invalidated or something like that, and you don't mind forcing everybody to log in again, or at least to ask for a new refresh token. You could also use something called the time window solution, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about or walking through. So in this case, you, again, are losing a little bit of the statelessness of the JWT. you're actually kind of reintroducing some state. It's not, again, the same level of state as it would be if it was an opaque token, but what you basically do is you have a webhook set up so that when the logout event happens, the revocation of that refresh token is communicated to all the APIs that are interested. And they now have an in-memory map of what users have been signed out. And so when they get a token, when they get a JWT, they can actually look in that in-memory representation and say, has this user been signed out? And the way that they'll look at it is they'll look at the expiration time. So let's say it's May 9th, 2020, and it's this time, and we issue a JWT, and our JWTs are good for 30 minutes. So that means that at a JWT issue right now at 1:12 will be good for 30 minutes. That means it expires at 1:42. That means that a JWT created 1 second ago would expire at 1:42:46. And if that is the time that I was notified of the breach, then I want to say anything that expires before this time, 1:42:46, for that user is an invalid JWT, even though according to normal JSON Web Token rules, it is valid because it expires in the future. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to do this extra special handling, and because I know the breach happened at 1:12:47, right? 1:12:47 is when the breach happened, and so any JWTs that were issued before then would have expired at 1:42:46, and that means that I should treat them as invalid. So again, you introduce a little bit of extra state, but now you have a really kind of a scalable, sustainable way to invalidate JWTs. And what you're really doing here is you're really dealing with, before the breach happened at 1:12:47, or before I was aware of it, things were all good. And after 30 minutes have gone by, all my JWTs are going to have expired anyway, so I'm good. But this kind of red zone in the middle is what we're dealing with. And so you need to decide how small you want that red zone to be, right? Do you want it to be 5 minutes or 1 minute or 5 hours? And then how do you want to deal with, how delicate is your data? Do you want to deal with this additional state and catching a webhook and keeping track of which users have had the refresh tokens revoked and whatnot? All right, gonna do a quick showing you some code. So this is all Apache license if you want to grab it and play around with it. So we're going to look at symmetric. So this is, I'm going to generate a JWT, and it is going to have this secret, this shared secret, and this is my payload that I'm going to generate. And this is all the user API as indicated, right? Like lines 3 to 19 are all happening in the user API, and then lines 20 to 24 are all, in the to-do API. You could imagine that. So the first, we're doing the, I just want to do something real quick. There we are. Great. So, and all we're doing here is we're not doing extended check for audience or issuer. We're just checking to make sure that it was signed correctly. So if we do rebuild, you can see that it outputs this JWT and then it immediately decodes it. We can also look at build. So this is very similar. This is just we're going to generate a private key, and in reality, you're really going to pull that from somewhere else, not necessarily from, you're not going to do this in Ruby. But the library, the encoding is the same, right? It doesn't really care. And that's actually one good point. I would say that I would never advise anyone to roll their own JWT library. It's complicated enough that I would definitely look out there. And this uses the Ruby-JWT library, which is a really great one, super easy to use and understandable. All right, so, and you can see that the header is different, right? If we look up here, this is the header of the previous one. This is the header here, and the signature is going to be different, but the payload is the same, and that's just because it's base. It's just URL encoded, base64 encoded. There's nothing special about the payload. All right, I think that's good enough for the code. Switch back to... Okay. So as far as kind of thinking about JWTs with Rails, you want to, if you're consuming a JWT that has been produced for you by something else, right? Whether that's FusionAuth or Keycloak or Okta or Auth0, you can use the JWT lib. And one thing you definitely want to make sure of, and I wrote a whole article about this, is that you don't just do what my code did, which is basically verify the signature is correct. That's a good first step, because that means that the JWT was signed by who you thought it was signed by. But you also want to look at those other claims, right? Who issued this? Who's the audience? Am I the audience of this? Because those are good things for your application to do. And frankly, that's on you. It's on whoever's consuming the JWT. And the JWT gem makes it easy to do those kind of checks, but you have to decide to do that. So I just mentioned the lib JWT default option. Oh, sorry, wrong thing. Yeah, I mentioned that because that's the default options, which I believe the only default options are it's going to check to see the signature was valid and that it is not an expired JWT. But you definitely want to look at the issuer and the audience too. As far as authorization, if you're building a simple Rails app, you could use filter, like a filter on application controller, and I've written some sample code to do that. There's also a devise integration, and I'll confess that I have not used it yet. So that would be definitely something I would look into if you're using devise for user authentication. And then someone else, a friend, pointed out this library called Knock, which again, I haven't had a chance to dig into, but that is another thing that is kind of automates the consumption of JWTs for protecting an API. So JWT tools, there are plenty of debuggers out there. Looks like this one's cut off, but I'll make the presentation available as a PDF as well. But there's lots of JWT debuggers, and they basically take that string of gobbledygook and turn it into the set of JSON, right? Give you the header and the payload. And then the JWT code that I showed you, if you want to download it and play around with it, it's available on the GitHub FusionAuth under the Apache license. So that's really it. I want to say thank you for having me. And if you have any questions about JWTs or Shira, feel free to reach out to me. I'm also happy to hang around here for a little bit, or actually in Slack might be the easiest way to if you have any other questions about JWTs. But thank you again for having me.
Awesome, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and as Dan mentioned at the top of the meetup, he is giving away a couple of T-shirts. So if you want to, if you're interested in those, I guess, do you have in mind what you think your most interesting interaction was for the first winner, or is that something you want to?
I gotta go with Mark. I gotta go with Mark. You know, asking about the performance costs. You know, always good to keep an eye on performance. So, Mark, if you don't want the T-shirt, Mark, I'm not going to force it on you. But if you do, I'd be happy to ship one to you.
Great. So the other one is going to be randomly given away to anyone who participated or who was around during this stream, or I guess shortly after perhaps watches the recording. So if you want to be considered for that, make sure to join us in our Slack channel. That's at the Dev Edmonton Slack. And if you don't know how to get there, go to yegrb.com/Slack to get yourself an invitation and join the Meetup Ruby channel. We will post the information to that. Actually, I think it's down below as well in the video details. But yeah, as Andy mentioned at the top of this, you know, we're probably going to be doing meetups like this for a while. Having people like Dan on is fantastic. That we wouldn't be able to do otherwise if we were doing this in person, at least as cheaply, because it's very expensive to fly people out. But if anyone has any feedback on how we're doing these, on how we can improve them, if people like the YouTube format because they can kind of consume at their leisure, if people might prefer something a little bit more personal, we could set up something where everyone can get on camera. You know, we want to do this in the way that is going to benefit our members the most. And if you've got any feedback, please talk to us on the Slack. We'd be happy to hear.
Cool.
So I think, unless we do have any questions coming from the chat, it looks like it probably is pretty much set. Then we will, again, be in the Slack for any follow-up questions. And thanks again for coming, Dan. Thank you, Andy, for introducing us this time. And we will see you next time, everybody.